I'm delighted that we have again as our guest the unconventional economist Leith Van Onselen, who's chief economist and co-founder of Macro Business. And there's an excellent newsletter of macrobusiness.com.au, which is available to anybody who wishes to read it. And I can tell you there's a lot to read, a lot of very, very persuasive and explanatory material, which are well worth looking at. Leith, the situation, and welcome.
G'day, David. How are you?
Thank you. And Leith, the big thing seems to be immigration. We don't seem to be getting what the government promised in relation to the reduction in immigration. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It certainly is correct, David. So, viewers might remember that the May federal budget this year projected that net overseas migration for last financial year, the one just gone, would fall to 395,000. Now, it turns out that immigration is going to be about 100,000 more than that. And just last week, we received some monthly migration numbers. So it's not technically net overseas migration, but the Australian Bureau of Statistics releases net permanent and long-term arrivals data, which is basically the same thing. It tracks the net overseas migration numbers almost perfectly. And what it showed is that in the first 9 months of this year, Australia received just under 394,000 net permanent and long-term arrivals. Now, that was 1,000 more than the corresponding period last year, which of course was a record year of migration. And it was also up about 130,000 on the same time in 2019 before the pandemic. So what this data effectively told us, David, is that immigration continues to run hot. Although the monthly arrivals numbers did peak in March, and they've been, since March, every month has been slightly lower than last year. But even so, Australia's immigration is running at very, very hot levels, well above what the budget predicted for this financial year. And it just suggests that immigration is going to remain higher than the federal government projected once again. And this is in the context of Labor's first federal budget in October 2022 after it got elected. It projected that we'd have 470,000 net migrants arrive in Australia over 2 years. And instead, we've had around 1 million. So they've effectively, the amount of migrants that we've received net has come in at more than double what Labor initially projected. And this is fundamentally, this extra 500,000 or so migrants that came in more than projected is effectively why we have the rental crisis, because that extra 500,000 plus people need somewhere to live. And there was some encouraging news last week, David. The Coalition Senator Bridget McKenzie actually fronted a AFR summit last week where she said that the bipartisan approach to immigration is over, that the federal government has snapped the migration compact, and that the coalition would make migration a battleground issue at the upcoming federal election, which I think is a very good thing, because Australians for decades, at least over a decade, have not supported this high immigration, yet all sides of politics, Labor, Liberal, Greens, have shoved it down our throats. And as a result, we've got obviously housing affordability issues, infrastructure issues, etc. One thing that was interesting that happened that came out today, though, is that the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, the coalition's Peter Dutton, suggested that he was going to oppose Labor's caps on international student numbers, which seems a little bit perverse because he has promised lower migration. But obviously, if you're going to oppose caps on international students, that would suggest that the coalition wants higher immigration, which seems a bit contradictory. What I'm hoping is that instead of going for blunt caps on student numbers, which is just a blunt instrument, the coalition will instead implement other measures to bring student numbers down and improve quality. For example, they could tighten English language proficiency requirements, tighten the amount of money that students must have before they come to Australia. They could also tighten academic standards, so make international students sit entrance exams before they come here. They could also implement a levy on international students, because our universities do not pay tax. They're non-profit organisations, and that way Australians could get a return, financial return on international students that come here instead of the universities privatising the gains. So it could be that the coalition's looking at those sorts of measures instead, which I hope it is. because that would lower international student numbers, but also improve quality.
So what you're saying is international students or international education should be genuine international education and not just an immigration front, which it seems to be at the moment.
Absolutely. We need a lower quantity of students, but a higher quality. So we effectively need genuine students to come here to study, not to come here as backdoor migration to work, etc., doing dodgy courses, and basically using the international education route to come to Australia, to get into the country to basically work and live, which is effectively the current system. What I'm hoping is the coalition will abandon the blunt caps, which really aren't much of a reduction. It will basically bring student numbers back to 2019, which was still the highest in the world, still far too high. But I'm hoping the coalition will instead go for these sort of qualitative caps instead. So they're not explicit caps, but basically making it harder to come to Australia to study, making it so that you have to be a genuine student with proper English language standards, with proper financial backing. So you've got to actually come over here with actual money so you can pay your way instead of having to come in here with almost nothing and working, and having proper academic credentials to study. I'm hoping they go down that route instead of just doing blanket, blunt caps, which is what Labor's gone for.
And this will have an impact on housing, of course. But the big issue of interest rates seems to be an area where the Reserve Bank is standing up to the government.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously we got the latest inflation data for the September quarter, and the headline inflation fell to 2.8%, which is within the RBA's band. And of course, Treasurer Chalmers was boasting that they've gotten inflation down. The problem with it is, though, that was artificially induced by the federal government's energy and rent subsidies. And the Reserve Bank instead looks at what's called underlying inflation, which is basically when you strip out the impact of those artificial subsidies. And it turns out that Australia's underlying inflation was still 3.5%, which is above the top end of the Reserve Bank's band of 3%. And as a result, the Governor, Michelle Bullock, basically said that the rates are going to remain on hold until next year. And since then, with the election of President Trump, etc., financial markets have actually pushed out their bets, their projections for interest rate cuts till July next year, which would be after the federal election if that came to fruition.
What impact do you expect, if I may interrupt you, what impact do you expect the new administration to have overall on the Australian economy?
Yeah, so there could be swings and roundabouts. So it could actually end up being deflationary or disinflationary for the Australian economy, not in time for the federal election because it's that's too soon. But over the medium term, it could actually end up being deflationary because if the US implements 60% tariffs on China or 100% on, say, electric vehicles, what that'll end up doing is it should end up with cheaper Chinese goods being dumped on the rest of the world. So it could mean that Australia, because they won't be selling as much to the United States, China could end up dumping cheaper products on Australia, which will actually lower our imported inflation. Now, it would obviously have a negative impact, or it could have a negative impact on our commodities exports. So obviously China's our biggest trading partner. We export a whole bunch of coal and iron ore, etc. Those things, there could be less demand for those things, because if the US is demanding less from China, China will demand less could demand less of those raw commodities. But we also don't know, because China could end up doing another stimulus program where it ends up building more empty cities or that sort of thing. Also, there is the chance that China does control a lot of rare earth commodities like lithium, etc. Like they're the main supplier to the world. Australia has a lot of that stuff, and the US could basically switch its buying of those commodities away from China to Australia. So there are swings and roundabouts. Yes. We don't really know what the impact is going to be, but I don't think it's nearly as doom and gloom as a lot of the media reports were saying. So
yes, media,
we've got a whole bunch of reports about doom and gloom, and I think they're overdone, David.
Yes. What do you think of what impact do you think the Trump administration will have if they significantly reduce interest rates and significantly reduce regulation and encourage investment flows? What impact will that have on Australia, do you think?
Yeah, well, if you look at the interest rates thing, that's kind of a bit interesting. So it depends how far he wants to go with it, because you think logically, if they did slap a massive tariff on Chinese goods, that would actually be inflationary. And also because it obviously push up the cost of imported goods from China, etc., that would actually increase inflation in the US economy. He's also flagged, big corporate tax cuts, big personal tax cuts, etc. That could also be inflationary. So I think most pundits are suggesting that US inflation will actually rise, and it'll probably keep interest rates higher for longer. But that being said, it actually should be disinflationary for the world for that reason, that they'll be buying less Chinese goods, and China will be dumping those products at a cheaper price on the rest of the world, because it won't have the biggest economy in the world to sell to. And sorry, I forgot the other second half of your question.
I was just wondering what other impacts it will have. For example, if he pulls out of the Paris Accord and is not hindered by the cost of net zero emissions and so on, and China and India are not also in any way impacted by that, what impact will that have on Australia, where we're really going out of our way? I think, for example, there was a complaint in the press this morning from a Swiss investor in Australia, Glencore, that the price of energy in Australia was significantly higher than in comparative countries because of our attempts to have net zero emissions.
Yeah, and we are committing economic suicide there. Let's be real. I mean, Australia's a rounding error on the world's emissions. I'm not saying we shouldn't. Australia should always strive for efficiency, and obviously, using its energy more efficiently is a good thing. And for example, all our houses should go to LED lights, etc. We've all done that. That's all a good thing. But this notion that we need to basically, hamstring ourselves, give ourselves uber expensive energy and input costs for the sake of net zero is ridiculous. When India, China are growing their emissions aggressively, at enormous rates, and dwarfing anything that we do, is ridiculous. And if the US then abandons its Paris Accord and starts increasing its emissions again, like I will add, the US has actually cut its emissions more per capita than Australia has, and it's done that by closing down coal and switching to natural gas as power generation and renewables. In Australia, we have made our gas very expensive, which I said previously, and that has actually meant that our coal plants stay running for longer, and we do not transition to natural gas instead because it's too expensive to do so. So
you've demonstrated very well how foolish we have been in relation to gas emissions and in relation to not having any domestic reservation in relation to gas.
Yeah, that's right. So Americans pay about US $2 to $2.50 per gigajoule their gas, which is about, $4 Australian, we'll say. And they are the biggest exporter in the world. We are the second biggest exporter in the world, so we sell less than the US to the world. But we pay on the East Coast about $12 a gigajoule for gas. So we pay 3 times what Americans pay. And Americans don't pay 3 times less because they have reserved their gas for domestic use. They have an America First approach. We have a China First approach, whereby we sell about 3/4 of Australia's East Coast gas to China, and we sell it on cheap long-term contracts while we gouge ourselves at home and drive up costs domestically. And as a result, as I just said before, we have effectively kept our coal-fired power stations open for longer because we can't use gas to switch it out, because gas is too expensive and we have shortages, artificial shortages, even though we export 3/4 of it overseas on the East Coast. So, in an ideal world, Dave, what we would have done is we would have given ourselves incredibly cheap gas, like America has, because we have oodles of gas, but we just choose to export almost all of it. And we actually export more gas. We actually use more gas converted to liquid to put on a ship to send to China than we use domestically, in domestic industry, for example. So it is completely stupid. And as a result, in the ideal world, David, we would have basically shut down our coal plants, build out the renewables, and used gas as the peaking fuel, because renewables are very intermittent. They're only good during the middle of the day when the sun's shining or when the wind blows. At other times, they're, quite frankly, useless. So in those other times when you don't have renewables running, you need to be able to switch on alternative, hydrocarbon power. And the best and most flexible hydrocarbon power is gas, because you can switch it on and off very quickly. You can't do that with coal and nuclear. So what Australia should have done is given ourselves cheap gas like America has done, shut down our coal-fired power stations and built out renewables, and that would have given us much lower emissions. And that's exactly what America's doing, and America's actually reducing its emissions faster than Australia is.
Yes. There was in one of your papers, it's headed "Apartment construction no longer financially viable." That is a fright for young people who want to rent an apartment. If the building of new ones is no longer financially viable, that is an extraordinary situation for a country like Australia to be in.
Yeah, it is. And especially it comes in the context of governments in New South Wales, Victoria, the federal government, etc., all saying that we've got to build high-rise apartments to accommodate its mad immigration. And basically, we've had a whole bunch of reputable players come out. Industry players come out over the last month and state that it's not financially viable to build apartments because construction costs have risen by about 40% since the pandemic. There's a lack of labour. A lot of builders have gone broke. Builders are competing against governments for infrastructure. We've got high interest rates, etc. And they're saying that at current prices, they can't build apartments for a profit, and therefore apartments aren't being built. And the only way that they're going to actually be able to build apartments is if the price of apartments rises significantly for where they are, which will then choke out demand from buyers because the price will then be above what buyers can afford to pay. So we're caught in a bit of a catch-22 here, whereby governments want high-rise construction to fit in its mad immigration program, but the developers can't afford to build those apartments at current prices. Therefore, prices must rise significantly. But we're talking about 30%. But if the prices do rise by 30%, nobody will be able to afford to buy those apartments. So it's a crazy situation. What's effectively happened in Australia is if you've done basic economics, the supply curve for Australia's housing construction has shifted to the left. So we've had a reduction in supply because of all the factors I mentioned before. And as a result, it costs more to build housing at every price point. And therefore, in order to restore balance to the housing market, you need to therefore cut demand. And the way you cut demand is you've got to reduce immigration. But the federal government instead is running a mad, extremely high immigration program into a market that has become supply constrained. And as a result, we have this gaping shortage of housing supply. We built about just under 170,000 homes last year. And the number of homes that have commenced construction for this financial year is about 160,000. And this is in the context of a population that's grown by about 600,000 people a year. So we've got a massive housing shortage that is getting worse, and it's driven by the government's immigration program. And the supply side of the market, the supply side of the housing market is structurally broken and cannot supply the homes at a reasonable cost because of high construction costs, labour shortages, higher interest rates, all these sorts of things. And quite frankly, David, the only genuine solution to this housing supply crisis is for the federal government to cut immigration hard, because you can't keep growing the population at a faster rate than the nation's capacity to build housing infrastructure, which is what we've done for 20 years. But it's gotten particularly dire at the moment because all the factors that determine how much you can build have gotten worse since the pandemic. And most notably of that is the 40% rise in construction costs since the pandemic. We're talking materials and labour, etc.
Well, on that point of very bad news, I think terrible news for the next generation, we'll have to bring this to a conclusion. But thank you once again for the way in which you so powerfully deliver information on what's exactly happening in the economy, sort of information we're not getting from the sources which should be providing that sort of information to us. Once again, thank you very much, Leith.
Thanks, David. Speak to you next time.
Certainly.